Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.
You're listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5, and in Studio 2 on the line I have the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, that's Matthew Dickerson. Hello, Matthew.
G'day, Tony. My pleasure to be with you.
Yes, it's a great pleasure for both of us because we've always got interesting things to discuss, whether we agree on things or not. And that's the way it should be too.
Exactly right.
Anyway, let's start off on a few things that's pertinent to Wellington. Well, of course, we always concentrate on the things in Wellington. It's also interesting to hear about the things that are going on in Dubbo as well, which would not be very relevant to our listeners here, and they wouldn't want to hear most of that. But was listening to the program this morning on community radio in Dubbo, so just to get a bit of an insight into that was interesting. But let's talk about the Bennelong Bridge and the Coomera Bridge situation, because my understanding is you've shifted some funding around there to suit the financial years, but there are some people who are concerned about what's happening with the Coomera Bridge as a result. Now, you say there's absolutely nothing to see there. Is that right?
Well, there is something to see there, but it's not dramatic as maybe some people might think. I'll talk briefly about the Bennelong Bridge because that is important as well. The Bennelong Bridge, we're replacing that. We've got the funds to replace that. We've got some government grants there to replace that bridge using some council money as well. And we've done all the work, the pre-work for that. We've done the land acquisition we need for all of that. But when we went out to do some of the pre-analysis work, keeping in mind that we'll have this bridge replaced by April next year, the engineers found that the existing bridge, and bridges typically have a 44-tonne limit on them, those rural bridges you see, that's a reasonable limit to be able to allow most stock and most trucks that they might need in a farming environment to get across that bridge. They noticed some structural defects on that bridge, so they immediately brought some engineers in to have a look at that, and they put a 15-tonne load limit on Bennelong Bridge immediately. Now, that's obviously bad, especially if they're coming up to a harvest season, and so farmers around that area were very concerned about that, of course. The big issue for us, Tony, was it was a challenge. We don't want to spend money on that bridge because it's going to be replaced by April next year. But between now and April, there's a harvest season to get through, and the detour that we had to put in place for that 15-tonne load limit on that bridge was a fairly significant detour. So we did some investigations, moved very quickly on that, and we've been able to secure a contractor that can actually do some repairs at a reasonable cost, $119,000, to be able to put that load limit back up to 44 tonnes. That'll be done by the middle of September, and then people will be able to get through their harvest. As a part of all of that, the Coomera Bridge, which we were initially hoping, and we've been talking to residents about the fact that that would be completed in this financial year. Now, as we've done further investigation on that, obviously talking to contractors to see exactly what's needed, and availability, it is tough to get any sort of trades at the moment, any sort of contractors. It seems that there's no way known, and so we'd rather tell residents about this early rather than late, no way known we're going to be able to finish that project off completely in this financial year. So what we did at council meeting last night was essentially moved some funds that we've received to the local roads and community infrastructure round 3 funding. So we moved some funds from Coomera Bridge to Bennelong Bridge in this financial year, but the same amount of money will still be spent on Coomera Bridge. It was really just shuffling of the deck chairs to match up with financial years and that grant funding. So when you say there's nothing to see, the one thing to see is that unfortunately it will take a little bit longer to finish that bridge than we initially had hoped for. It'll still be done. It'll still be done to the same standard. The same amount of money will still be spent on that. It just won't be completed in this financial year as we had originally hoped.
Yep. Matthew, I know you're dealing with problems to do with the previous council. The sins of the past haven't gone away yet, unfortunately, particularly in the way money was used inappropriately, you might say, or you might not, depending on your point of view. It certainly was not used in the way it was intended, and that raises lots of questions and eyebrows, of course. But in the meantime, you have to address those issues and fix them, and also believe that you are looking at a program, a shared pathway program to try and move forward after you plug all the holes up in the dike, which hopefully won't be too far away, and develop a pathway for the development of both Dubbo and Wellington?
Well, there's a few things there, Tony, a few things in what you've said there, which you're right, it is disappointing. It does seem like we've got a great group of councillors now and they're very keen to see Dubbo and Wellington progress and do the best we possibly can, but unfortunately we do seem to have to keep looking over our shoulder and fixing up some of the errors of the past, as you say. And one of the ones that became evident at the council meeting last night was that we had some funding that we received for 3 projects in Dubbo, and that's the Macquarie River Event Precinct, the Heritage Plaza out the front of the old Dubbo Jail, and the Radri Cultural Tourism area or tourism project. 3 great projects and significant funds were received, but here's the real irony in this particular one, Tony. They didn't actually look at the any business case or any real analysis of the cost of those particular projects. And as a result of that, we've now got about a $9.3 million shortfall in funding. The irony here is that they spent $100,000 in the last council on a business case for a state government facility. Meanwhile, local government facilities, they weren't really doing proper analysis on. So we did a couple of things last night. The first thing we did was we shuffled some of those monies around and formally resolved to go ahead with the Macquarie River Events Precinct and the Heritage Plaza, use the funding from the Radri Cultural Tourism Project to move across to those projects and then go out and look for further funding for that. And that's part of a different funding project or program from the federal government. And then in addition to that, we're putting in funding applications and expression of interest for Growing Regions Program Round 1. One of those projects we'll put in for in that is Shared Pathway in Wellington. A couple of other projects as well, an animal shelter rebuild, Macquarie River Sandy Beach erosion, and the Radri Cultural Tourism Centre. That will be part of that expression of interest that we'll put in there as well. Now, hopefully, we'll get a good outcome out of those. You never know with grant applications. You put in lots and you receive some, but hopefully we can do that and that'll be a good result for Wellington and also a good result for Dubbo if we get the result that we hope we'll get out of those.
Okay, because speaking of sins of the past, Wellington is still being severely affected by the Cameron Park debacle. Just last week I was at the markets in Wellington here, and one of the citizens who won an art award actually in the exhibition next door was relating to me how some visitors came to Wellington. Both toilets were blocked up. The handicapped toilet was locked up. That's a very serious situation. That's the problem when you've only got one cubicle for a male and one for a female. Anything goes wrong with the cubicles, whether it gets accidentally soiled or if it gets blocked up, well, you're stuffed, basically. And there's not much you can do except perhaps council needs to, front up and say, OK, we made a mistake here. We've got to do something in the interim. Let's increase the maintenance at least to make sure that these problems do get addressed very promptly.
And that is a reasonable suggestion to make sure the maintenance is being done correctly on that. So I will follow that up for you, Tony, to make sure that's happening. If any residents of Wellington do see an issue there and they want it taken care of, just ring 68014000 and say that it's an urgent issue because the toilet is blocked up there. And you're right, Tony, I don't really understand. Again, I wasn't on council, I wasn't part of the decision making, so it's hard for me to get my head wrapped around it. But I don't really understand how they spent $310,000 on the renewal of that and reduced so dramatically the number of toilets, and as you say, effectively one male and one female, to give you, and that was a few years ago. Building prices have gone up, but to give you an idea, the Macquarie Lions Park West toilet block that we're doing at the moment, we're doing that for $316,000, so only $6,000 more, and again, that's several years later, so prices have gone up in that time. But for that price, we're getting 5 female cubicles, 2 male cubicles, 3 urinals, male urinals, and a disabled toilet. So I really don't understand what the logic was of doing the toilet in that way in Cameron Park. It is something that councillors have talked about. There is no budget for it this year, unfortunately, to do anything about that. I suspect that at some time in the near future, not this financial year, but sometime in the near future, there'll be another toilet block added in Cameron Park so that you've got somewhere reasonable for tourists to stop at, for bus loads of people to stop at, that type of thing, because it does seem inadequate for the number of people that you would like to have going through Cameron Park.
Yeah, and of course, Matthew, you know very well I'm going to keep this on the radar and hopefully get it into the next financial year's budget. It would be good to see something happen there. Now, the other thing we touched on last time was the what do you call it? State, I think it's New South Wales Conference of Councillors, basically, and you've got 9 councillors going.
There was some discussion around the fact that we had 8 councillors going, Tony, but we actually had 9 who wanted to go to that, and we just had to fix it up at the council meeting last night. And I think that's fantastic. There's been some criticism in some print media around this fact that 9 councillors, or 8 they were talking about at the time, are going to the Local Government New South Wales Conference. Now, part of that is this image that people often have of going to a conference that it's a junket and people sit around and drink beers all day and harump with their cigar smoking. Anyone that's been involved with a Local Government New South Wales Conference knows that it's a lot of work, but it's actually incredibly important work because there's so much learning to be had. Now, we've got 10 councillors on council at the moment. 8 of those have never been on council before. They're now at the point they've got about a year and a half worth of experience and they've learned a lot in that time. But sharing information amongst other councils from across the state, keeping in mind that Local Government New South Wales is the peak body for the 128 councils across the state. So it's a very important conference to be at. And there's a number of things that happen at this conference. The first thing you do is you see presentations from various experts and members of parliament. You also have debate around policy positions for Local Government New South Wales to take to the state and sometimes the federal government to try and change policy. But the really important thing at any conference, Tony, as you would know, having attended conferences yourself, is you get the discussion at morning tea time, at lunchtime, after the conference finishes, the contacts you make, the people you discuss things with. Hey, we've got this real problem here. We're not sure what to do. Oh, well, in our council, this is what we did. So you get that sharing of ideas, and I guarantee every councillor that attends this conference in November will come back with some additional ideas that they can use to make it better in Dubbo Regional Council. So I would like to see all councillors attend every Local Government New South Wales conference every year if it's possible, but they've got to take time off from work, they've got to take annual leave, they've got to take time away from family. It's not a junket by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, and the other issue that I wanted to talk about was something we've discussed before in actual fact, and that is tree preservation orders. And there's various levels of how council approaches or can approach preserving trees and promoting, which is even more important, promoting tree plantings, particularly replacements in the local urban environment, because it keeps it cooler, it looks better, and it has all those utility values. But there is a bit of a difference between, say, a tree preservation order and the other kind of thing which we've got in place now, which is all about if the trees are identified as being of certain value, they would be certainly preserved. But there is a movement to try and get tree preservation orders, which basically mean if you have a tree in your backyard, you have to get council permission to remove it, even from your own backyard. So if you're a landscaper or a keen gardener or something, your flexibility is going to be severely dented, I would suggest.
So this will be a community consultation process, so we really are keen to hear from the community. And you're right about our current process. We've got a thing called a significant tree register, and you can apply to have a tree added to the significant tree register, and that'll be assessed, and then it may be added, it may not. If it is added, then if you own that tree, if that tree was in your yard, your property, for example, you would have to get council permission to do anything significant to that tree, including knock it down. Now, tree preservation orders, there are different standards across different councils across the state where rather than have a significant tree register, some councils have a process where if a tree meets certain criteria, it might be the height of the tree, it might be the diameter of the actual trunk of the tree, for example. If it meets certain criteria, then automatically you can't do anything with that tree until you get permission from council. That's exactly what council's looking at, and part of this consultation will be whether the community would like that. You've made some good points there about the tree canopy, about as we go forward with a changing climate, having an increased tree canopy is important. But again, it's all about what you can do in your backyard versus what's good for the overall community. So that's where we're at the moment. In October this year, we'll have a report that will come back to council with the outcome from that community consultation. But really what I would encourage people to do is keep an eye out for it. We'll do some consultation. We really need to hear from people what they think, because some people are very keen for us to see a strict tree preservation order put in place. I've had other people who have told me they don't want council telling them what to do in their backyard. We need to work out what the community wants and then deliver on that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is there. Matthew, we have various funds available for not-for-profits and charities in our area here, some of which is funded or funds are channelled through council, and currently you have a fund which is, you found, particularly confusing. It's been a long-standing two funds, should I say, a bunch of two funds that are sort of handed out at the same time. Well, I think one's called the Assistance Services Fund or Services Fund or whatever you want to call it. It's very confusing, isn't it?
I actually did find it confusing. When I was on Dubbo City Council before, we had one fund that was available for community organisations to apply for. I had my little hiatus from council, and then when I came back, there were two funds, and there was one that was called the Community Assistance Fund and one that was called the Community Services Fund. One was available for not-for-profits, one was available for community service organisations. And I must admit, I didn't really understand the subtle differences between those two funds. There were different amounts you could apply for, there were different rules, but I just thought it seemed overly complicated. And I did actually talk to our staff about this, because when people are making applications for these funds, they are volunteers, part-time volunteers. They really don't have the time to go through and put together a comprehensive application, having read through all the detailed rules of these. So I actually thought it was a little bit overly complicated, and certainly councillors thought the same thing. What we resolved last night was to basically combine those two funds, have one fund only. Funds will be available for not-for-profit community-based organisations, and I'm really not aware of too many for-profit-based community organisations, but not-for-profits, if you've got a valid reason to put an application in, we want to make that application process simpler, want to make the rules simpler, and just have the one fund. I haven't heard some examples of organisations that said, I didn't actually know which one I could apply to, so I just put in two applications, one in each, and let council work it out. So if it's at that level of confusion, then I think we've got something wrong. But again, let's fix up some of the errors of the past, and that's one of the ones we've just fixed up now. So there'll be one fund, there'll be two rounds each year, so there'll be two end dates for those two applications each year, and then we'll hand out that money to those community-based, those not-for-profit community-based organisations. So I think it's a good move, make it simpler, and we'll keep reviewing that. And if there's things that people find when they do put those applications in that we could streamline that even further, that makes it better for those organisations and better for council, we'll look at that as well.
Okay, I should mention here the closing date for the current round of those two funds is this Monday, but now that's been delayed to, or put over to postponed, should I say, to another date, yet to be decided, I take it?
Correct. Those two funds, the application process was paused on those two pending the fact that this was going to council in July. So even though those funds normally did open up a few weeks ago, then we did actually say to the community, hold there for a little bit, because council is going to consider a report on this in the July council meeting, which we've now done. We've now resolved to have the one fund, and then we'll open up applications again with those new rules.
Okay, I was most amused this morning listening to your interview with Richard Mutton there in Dubbo, being described as a pragmatist, because he was not very happy about the changes to the council chamber in Dubbo, and for councillors to be sitting around holding meetings, by the sounds of it, probably on the old wooden fruit cases.
If the worst thing I'm accused of, Tony, after my time on council is being pragmatic, then I can live with that label. I think that's not the worst thing to call someone. And it was definitely a pragmatic solution. I actually thought the old council chamber was quite nice. It had some history there. It had started in 1972. Council meetings had started there. In 1980, there was an amalgamation between Talbragar Shire and Dubbo City Council, and then Norm Cox was mayor at the time in 1987 when Norm passed away. That chamber was named after Norm officially, and this is all the Dubbo chamber I'm talking about, of course, the Wellington chamber. No changes being made down there. And one of the things that I found interesting there with this particular one was that we had a fairly large space there for councillors to sit around, for the staff to sit around, public gallery, and that was used twice a month. That might have been used sometimes maybe for 5 hours in a month. And it just seemed like too large a space to keep reserved to be used on such a rare occasion. And that costs money. We've got a building across the road from council in Church Street in Dubbo where we've got our staff housed. Once we made the decision to move the chamber from where it is, that freed up that space. We'll be able to move our staff across from that building across the road. We could sell that building or we could rent that out. And again, this is about maximising the return for ratepayers. So that's the decision council made. We've got some downstairs meeting rooms. Those meeting rooms are used most of the time during the day for various meetings, various conferences, etc. They can be reconfigured into different sizes. We've now got it set up so that twice a month they'll be reconfigured into council chamber. And then we'll have our meetings there, our standing committee meetings, our council meetings. And then next morning, for example, we had our meetings last night. This morning, those rooms are being used for normal meetings, normal conferences there. And that is a very pragmatic solution. The other part of the solution that may well have been missed in that other interview when you heard this morning, the importance of this may have been missed. We want to make sure that we've got the council chamber open to everyone, whether that be a councillor or a staff member or someone from the public gallery. And if you're in a wheelchair or you found it difficult to walk to get to the last chamber, you would have to go up a ramp to the front office of council. Then you'd have to get up a lift and go up the lift. Then you'd have to walk along and go down another mini lift, down a stairwell lift to get to the level of the chamber. And then where the public gallery sat, you still had steps to go up there. So some people, maybe, that were in a wheelchair or maybe found it difficult to walk, may have made the decision not to come along because it was all too difficult. Now we've got the council chamber on the ground floor and there's one simple ramp to go up to go straight onto the level of that council chamber. So it makes it more accessible as well, and I think that's important.
Yeah, so you might say it was a lift too far in the first place. And now what you've got, of course, is a pop-up council chamber with, I take it, a pop-up gallery as well. Yes, according to Richard, it's lost all its regality.
Yeah, and it was interesting because when I first got onto council, there'd been a fire at the council building the year before I was first elected in 2004. And so when I first got onto council, we were having meetings at the former Dubbo High School in a classroom or an assembly hall. I can't remember exactly what it used to be used before when it was a school, but there certainly wasn't a lot of gravitas or regality to meeting in a classroom as such. Again, the important part is that you've got councillors with the right attitude, reading the information, doing the research, making good decisions. You could do that sitting around on a paddock if you want, or sitting around somewhere with a lot of regality about it. But the important thing is the attitude of the councillors, and I think our councillors have got the right attitude about getting those decisions right.
Okay, so you're not going so far as a tent in the park or something like that, I take it?
Well, we did have one meeting back in 2014. I remember it was a very controversial subject, and so we knew there was going to be a large public gallery, so we actually held the meeting over in the flat floor theatre in the Dubbo Regional Theatre and Convention Centre. So that was a huge room for a council meeting. So I've been involved in meetings in somewhere as large as that, in our formal council chamber, in Dubbo High School, and now in a meeting room. Again, I don't think we made bad decisions or good decisions based on where we were. It was all about the people and the research and the focus to the getting the decisions right in a very pragmatic way.
Yeah, that's the all important thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, we've been talking to the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, Matthew Dickerson, on Binjang 91.5.
Thank you, Tony. Always a pleasure to be chatting about council items.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.